Hello everyone, and welcome to our fourth session for the spring 2015 semester for Sociology 111, Introduction to Sociology. My name is Matthew Howell. I'm the full-time sociology instructor at the Valparaiso campus here at Ivy Tech. My email address is mhowell1, that's MHOWELL1, at ivytech.edu. Should you have any questions about anything or need to talk to me about anything, you can contact me there. Today we are going to be covering Chapter 6, Groups and Organizations. Some of the things we're going to be trying to do: understanding groups, understanding organizations. We'll take a look at the changing workplace. We'll examine unions on a global scale. Some of the questions we'll be trying to answer: do we behave differently in large groups than in small ones? How do we make large organizations manageable? And what effect are current social changes having on the structure of groups? First thing we need to do, of course, is define what we're talking about. We say the word group. Everybody has some kind of idea about what a group is. But in sociology, what we're talking about is any number of people, two or greater, with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact regularly. It's not just being in proximity to somebody on a regular basis, like waiting for a bus. That doesn't necessarily make you part of a group unless you interact with those people on a regular basis. If you all just stand there quietly in a line waiting for the bus to show up without talking to each other and you don't know each other, you're more like an aggregate of people. Charles Horton Cooley, sociologist who gave us the idea of the looking glass self, also gave us this concept, the concept of primary group, a small group with intimate face-to-face association and cooperation. Those are the characteristics of a primary group. And in a primary group, the group itself is the purpose of the group. Expanding on the ideas of Cooley, it was Robert Merton who gave us the idea of secondary groups. Larger, formal, impersonal groups with little social intimacy or mutual understanding. So if we can think about two groups with which we're associated, family and work. Family would be an example of a primary group. Work would be an example of a secondary group. Another way we can think about groups are the attitudes that individuals have about particular groups. In-group and out-group. In-group is any group or category to which people feel they belong. That which people kind of feel describes them or with which they affiliate. Out-group, that would be the opposite, of course, any groups or categories to which people feel they do not belong, or that does not affiliate with them or define them in any way. When we think about social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the whole idea of in-group and out-group in the South really was about whether you were white or not. And so we can see how these conflicts between in-group and out-group can turn violent on a personal as well as political level. Another type of group is a reference group. A reference group is kind of like Mead's idea of a significant other, but with a group instead of an individual. It's a group that individuals use as a standard for evaluating their own behavior. Just like a significant other is an individual that we may use when referencing behaviors and how we're supposed to act. A reference group is kind of the same thing. And family, work, church congregation, these can serve as reference groups for an individual. Reference groups set and enforce standards of conduct and belief. In general, will be influenced by more than just one reference group. Two groups that we use for evaluating behavior. Within a group may form a special type of group, which is a coalition, temporary or permanent alliance gears toward a common goal. And coalitions kind of exist within the context of a larger group organization. Georg Simmel was a sociologist who did a lot of work in what would be called kind of forms of interaction as a discipline within sociology. He's generally considered to be kind of a symbolic interactionist theorist. What he did was he gave us this idea of small group interactions and ways that they differ from larger group interactions, and different types of small group interactions and how those can kind of shape the nature of the interaction. He did a lot of work looking at kind of dyads, triads, and then he had these ideas of larger groups beyond that, parties, and formal organizations. For him, a large group was a formal organization. A party was an unstructured large group that functions similar to a small group. If we think about the idea of Cooley and Merton and their ideas of primary and secondary groups, in general, Simmel's idea on small group interactions would be characterized by what Cooley would term primary group. And for Simmel, larger group interactions would be more characterized by the ideas of Merton in secondary groups. But Simmel also had the idea was a party, which was a large group that had kind of small group characteristics. It was the big difference between a small group and a party was in the nature of the focus of the group. Small groups tend to be unifocal. Larger groups are multifocal. And so for a party, it was still an unstructured group that did not have a kind of an outside purpose, but it was multifocal instead of unifocal. So when we're thinking about Simmel, what he's most remembered for in context of group interaction is how the size of a group shapes the nature of the interaction. Dyad and a triad. And now, like I said, Simmel did a lot of work on interaction. He also gave us the idea of a stranger and how interaction with a stranger is shaped differently than interaction with somebody with whom you have a degree of intimacy. Between a dyad and a triad, Simmel documented an entire kind of array of dynamics that can shift. So if we think about some of the dynamics that shift in a dyad, which is just two people, you either have consensus or disagreement on a particular issue, a particular topic, a particular decision. There can only be agreement or disagreement. There can't be anything beyond that. But if you add one more person, that dynamic can shift. And you have four new dynamics that can be created. The first one is if it's a conflict over a particular issue, there's a third person in a party can function as a neutral mediator. So you have the potential for neutral mediation. The third person can cast the tie-breaking vote, and so you have the tyranny of majority rule. The third person could be what Zimmel referred to as tertius gaudens, the third who profits, taking it from a Latin term. If you think about in the case of divorce, which is a conflict between two members of maybe a triad in which the child is the third member, oftentimes the parents will both spend as much of their resources as they can, time and money, on the child, trying to sway the child to their side in a conflict, or just trying to establish a strong relationship with the child in a less Machiavellian note. But so the child did not cause the situation, the schism between the parents. Nevertheless, the child is profiting from that situation. And that would be a prime example of what Zimmel referred to as tertius gaudens. And then there is divide et impera, or divide and conquer. And this is the third who causes conflict between the other two in order to benefit themselves. These four different dynamics are only possible in groups that have three or more people. So the difference between a group of two and a group of three changes those dynamics. Additionally, a dyad is the most intimate of groups because there's only two people in the group. At the same time, it's the most fragile of groups. And when Zimmel was talking about the intimacy of the group, he wasn't referencing the fact that we look at marriage as a dyad, a union between two people with a high degree of romantic love involved in it. No, he was talking about both members of a dyad rely on the other member for the continued existence of the group. Regardless of whether you're talking about friendship, co-workers in a coalition, two people trying to found a social movement, two people trying to do volunteer charity work, whatever draws those two people together. If you only have two people in the group, both members of the group rely on that other member for the continued existence of the group. Because that's another dynamic that shifts. We talk about the fragility of the dyad. Add one more person to triad, and all of a sudden the group can survive the loss of a single member. So in a certain sense, the group is greater than the sum of its parts once you get to three members, because the group survives and continues on even if you lose a member. And so all of these dynamics shift when you talk about the difference between a dyad and a triad. And Zimmel's the person who kind of did the theoretical work on this. Another phenomenon, social phenomenon that has been researched is this idea of groupthink, which is collective pressure to conform to a predominant line of thought. And there was, I want to say it was Solomon Asch who did some research on this in the guise of, it was covert research where the identity of the researcher was kind of concealed as a sociologist doing social research or behavioralist doing behavioral research. It was done in the guise of a research on a visual acuity. And the actual subject of the research thought that they were only one of 6 subjects. The other 5 supposed subjects were in fact part of the social experiment, documenting this. Anyway, what Asch did was he had 3 lengths of line and then another length of line, and what you were supposed to do is select which of the 3 lengths of line matched the separate length of line. And the answer was fairly obvious. The lines were somewhat like really radically different in length. But the first 5 respondents would select an incorrect length of line. And what the purpose was to find out how often the actual subject would go along with the group in contrary to the evidence of their own senses. And it was roughly 33%. And that's fairly substantial portion of the population that will give a wrong answer to go along with the group. And if you think about the polarization that our country is undergoing right now, groupthink can help us to understand that, because we understand that the group can exert pressure to conform. And when you're talking about needing support of your fellow politicians for re-election, that pressure can become very, very strong. Oftentimes, groupthink is a factor in asking for independent researchers, independent counsel, independent negotiators, facilitators to be brought in, the request for those to be brought in, because they can help, they can avoid the pressure of the group that it exerts to for conformity. When we talk about an organization is kind of a formal type of group. And so a formal organization is a group that's structured for a purpose, to achieve a particular goal, and designed for maximum, and structured for maximum efficiency. There are a number of different types of formal organizations. Coercive, normative, and utilitarian formal organizations. Utilitarian formal organizations would be the most prevalent, and private businesses operated for profit are a utilitarian formal organization, as are government agencies that provide some type of public function, like police, firefighters, things like that, what we call the public services. Normative formal organizations are those formal organizations, think more along the lines of charities, volunteer associations, social services. Those are organizations that say people in our society need help beyond what the structures of society provide. And coercive, of course, would be prisons, mental institutions, aspects of the military, but they're organizations in which individuals have curtailed freedom, curtailed rights. The statuses, ascribed statuses. Now, remember our discussion on statuses. Achieved statuses are statuses towards which we work. Ascribed statuses are statuses with which we're born. Gender and race as ascribed statuses, and ethnicity as ascribed statuses. Sexual orientation, if it's overt instead of hidden. Disability. These ascribed statuses can influence how we see ourselves within formal organizations. Bureaucracy is a component of a formal organization that essentially creates a hierarchical structure governed by written rules and designed to accomplish goals with maximum efficiency. Max Weber, when he was thinking of his ideal types, bureaucracy was among the first ideal types he worked with. And he came up with these characteristics of a bureaucracy in its ideal type that every bureaucratic structure seems to exhibit. And this is what Weber used, the abstract construct, as a model for evaluating specific cases of a bureaucratic structure. And so the ideal type gave you these 6 characteristics found across bureaucratic structures that faced dissimilar environmental conditions and were dissimilar enterprises. The first characteristic is an extensive division of labor, and accompanying the division of labor, a specialization of task. People within a bureaucracy do a specific type of job. You have a hierarchy of authority or a chain of command. And sticking within that chain of command becomes an important part of the rules governing operation within a bureaucratic structure. the rules are standardized. They're written rules and regulations, and they are applied equally to every single individual within that bureaucratic structure. Impersonality. A bureaucratic structure has an impersonal nature in that it treats everybody kind of the same, and this is what Weber actually felt led to feelings of alienation in society, was the impersonal nature of interaction within the bureaucratic structure. Think about going to student affairs, and I'm sure that this, unless you've developed kind of a working relationship with somebody in student affairs, but the first time you went into student affairs, the first thing they want to know is if you're a current or prospective student. If you're a current student, the first thing they ask you for is your C number. That's kind of the identifier you have. And so being reduced to a number in a bureaucratic structure, that level of impersonality is what Weber felt led to alienation, feelings of alienation in kind of formal organizations in societies. Employment based on technical qualifications. A lot of times you have credentialism associated with that as well, in that in order to do a specific job within a particular bureaucratic structure, you will have to demonstrate that you have acquired the relevant skills. For example, teaching sociology for Ivy Tech Community College, you need to have a minimum of a master's degree in sociology or a master's degree in a different discipline with 18 credit hours in sociology. And those are the technical qualifications you need to have to be a sociology instructor. There are different technical qualifications for different positions, but each of them have technical qualifications upon which employment is based. And there is one more that Weber kind of highlighted, which was formal written communication as well. Everything is communicated by email here at Ivy Tech. That's the formal written communication. So, division of labor, specialized experts performing specific tasks. When we think about the division of labor and alienation, for Marx, the division of labor exists in factory work and is characterized by the division of manufacture into component tasks. So, for example, if we think about making a chair, there are a number of different tasks in there. And in factory work, making a chair gets divided down into, some people may be making all the dowels, another person may be manufacturing the seat, another person may be assembling the dowels into the seat, another person may be working on backs, and then another person attaches the back of the chair. Instead of one person doing all of the steps to construct that chair. And this is when you have an extensive division of labor in society and that tasks are reduced down to their component parts, and each person only does that one task, and then through being paid a wage or a salary goes into the market to provide for all of their needs. But when we think of it in context of bureaucracy, which is more the Weberian approach, it is kind of a fragmentation of work that removes connection workers have to overall objective of bureaucracy, is also what Weber would have called the irrationality of rationalization or red tape, when the rules, adherence to the rules governing the bureaucratic structure, supplant the efficiency that those rules are there to promote in the first place. Trained incapacity also exists. If you think about going into a McDonald's, um, and for whatever reason, there only seems to be one person operating the cash register and a line of people stretching towards the door, and there's 15 people milling around in the back of the restaurant doing various things, but nobody comes up to open up another register to help take orders. And that is in all probability because those people have not yet been trained or have not been trained on the register. And so workers working in the back become so specialized that all they can do are tasks associated with working in the back of the restaurant. People cannot do every facet of working in McDonald's. And this is what Marx believed was dehumanizing work, dehumanizing labor, meaningless work, work in which there is no sense of the worker invested. There's hierarchy of authority, written rules and regulations. As students at Ivy Tech, you are responsible for knowing all of the policies in the student handbook governing behavior. Even if you haven't read them, you're still responsible for them. But they ensure uniform performance of every task. Each position under supervision of higher authority, there are a number of steps in between me and the person in charge of all of Ivy Tech with regards to hierarchy of authority. The written rules and regulations governing the way people do their jobs ensures that even if people leave and other people come in, the jobs are done in the same way. Again, we see here is actually this idea of goal displacement, overzealous conformity to official regulations that becomes red tape, the irrationality of rationalization. Bureaucratic norms dictate that officials perform duties without personal consideration to people as individuals. This is what leads to alienation, according to Weber, because here is where you get this idea of people feeling like a faceless cog in a machine, or feeling like nothing more than a number to a bureaucratic structure. Employment based on technical qualifications. And I said some of that may be some form of credentialism, needing a particular credential to do specific jobs. The Peter principle is something a little bit different. Have you ever worked at a place where you had a manager and you thought, how in the world did this manager ever get his job, because it doesn't seem like he knows what he's doing at all? That's because of the Peter principle. What happens is people who do their jobs well get promoted into other positions. And as long as they're successful at meeting the responsibilities of the position to which they've been promoted, they will be a prime candidate for promotion again, and they will eventually get promoted until they are no longer able to perform the responsibilities of the job. So every employee within a hierarchy tends to rise to his or her level of personal incompetence. And that's the Peter principle. Now, these bureaucratic structures, if you think about it, there are bureaucratic structures at work, at school, politics. There are bureaucratic structures and hierarchies of authority in just about every aspect of life. This process of bureaucratic structures coming to dominate a society is referred to as bureaucratization. And it's the process by which every organization within a society comes to be dominated by the bureaucracy. Bureaucratic structures, whatever the reason the organization was founded for, inevitably bureaucratic structures come to view their own existence as essential and come to perform actions that ensure their continued survival. It can take place within small group settings. The iron law of oligarchy. Oligarchy, if you think about it, look at the similarity it has to the word monarchy and then think mono. Monarchy is rule of one. Well, oligarchy is rule of a few. And so what happens is if you think about it, when you go to get something done at Ivy Tech, it seems to be, there are people who kind of understand how to get things accomplished within the bureaucratic structure of Ivy Tech and seem to be more adept than other people at getting things done. And being able to get things done within a bureaucratic structure is kind of a form of power. And what happens is bureaucracies inevitably become dominated by a few people who understand how the bureaucracy operates and understand how to get things done within that bureaucracy, or who may control a key area of functioning of the bureaucracy. A lot of times, whoever's in control of authorizing expenditures of finance will be one of the people ruling a bureaucratic structure, because they're the one that can sign off on expenditures that get done. So that gives them power within the bureaucratic structure. Frederick Taylor was a social researcher who kind of created this idea of scientific management. He had this idea that if you understand how to motivate workers and how to optimize workers' earnings, and understand that workers are governed by economic rewards, mostly economic rewards, and if you can maximize their economic rewards, you don't have to understand exactly what they're doing in order to manage them. He referred to these principles as scientific management. And when you think about operations within a bureaucratic structure, classical theory of kind of looking at bureaucratic structures is founded in Frederick Taylor's scientific management approach, in that it looks at workers as primarily motivated by economic rewards. Trying to understand organizational cultures and understand workers in organizational cultures, you can use that particular approach, but there's also a later approach developed that's called the human relations approach, and this examines the fact that economic rewards are not the only rewards that dictate whether or not workers are happy, satisfied, or are going to stay or be productive at a particular job. So it looks at the role of people, communication, and participation within a bureaucracy, and how people are regulated within the bureaucracy and how they're treated within the bureaucracy, essentially, as important functions of understanding the organizational culture as well. When we look at this, and it says formal organizations have been experimenting with new ways of getting the job done since the late 20th century. Charles Deming, who helped Japan reorganize after the end of World War II, developed a lot of principles, the Deming approach to management, which was a way of governing a formal organization. Frederick Taylor, in his scientific management, was looking at ways, he was working in the 20s and 30s, looking at ways of governing formal organizations. So when we talk about thinking of ways of getting the job done, this is something that's been going on for a while, but thinking of new ways of getting the job done, like some of the newer things that have come along, collective decision-making, when they say minimal hierarchy or a much flatter hierarchy within a particular government or organizational structure, not government, I'm thinking bureaucracy, and even I tend to think bureaucracy associated that way with government, but formal organizations having flatter hierarchical structures in them, where you have a number of teams instead of different strata of management in a vertical hierarchy. You have a much more horizontal hierarchy where you have a number of teams that all report as equals to a particular individual. And then, like I said, we have these project teams and task forces, which can be temporary or permanent coalitions within this formal organization. A task force is generally going to be a temporary. A project team will be more permanent. And project teams, after they finish one project, will move on to another project. Task force tend to dissolve, and then a new task force is created when a new task comes up. Increased reliance on outside providers, an increased prevalence of independent contractors, and then facilitated communication between those at the very top and the very bottom of hierarchies. At Ivy Tech, if you've heard of the What's Your Idea project, that is a project by which any student, staff, or faculty member at Ivy Tech has a direct line to President Tom Snyder's office with their suggestions. They go all the way straight to his office. Other ways that work is changing: flex time, allowing people to, as long as they work the 40 or 50 or how many hours a week they're supposed to work, allowing them to come in at different times of the day, and even come in on alternate days of the week, Saturdays and Sundays, or telecommuting, employees who work part-time at home rather than in an outside office. Thinking about that, I'm actually telecommuting today. Valparaiso campus was closed today, but here I am still conducting the lecture from home. Number of telecommuters in 1995, roughly 8.5 million. That has increased to 40 million in 2008. And I think if you include a lot of people who, like I might not technically be considered a telecommunicator because I work on campus a set number of hours a week, but I do it at least part-time. A lot of what I do, I can do from home. Electronic communication. How is this changing the workplace? Email is efficient, rapidly communicated, and democratic. However, something interesting, some of the cons, those are pros. Cons of it: does not convey body language, leave a permanent record, and can be monitored. And interestingly enough, email is already kind of on the way out as a major form of communication in social groups. It's still widely used in formal organizations, but instant messengers and Twitter and Skype have kind of reduced the reliance on email as a private form of communication. But thinking about it in context of formal organizations, it communicates, or electronic communication contributes significantly to fragmentation of work. We get interrupted by emails. When we talk about fragmentation of work, instead of sitting and working, and you may be familiar with this, working on something for a fixed period of time, we will interrupt working on a project. We will even sit in meetings, and through cell phones and tablets and things like that, we'll check email and other forms of e-communication. And that's what it means when it talks about fragmentation of work, is that our attention is constantly being fragmented away from work to check email communications, so that we can communicate about work. So the irony there is that an improvement in communication actually leads to fragmentation of work. when we think about unions in the United States of America, unions are on the outs, and what has been referred to as right-to-work legislation or union-busting legislation does, in some respects, get free government agencies of the need to work with unions. Union advocates oppose right-to-work legislation because it destroys the power of collective bargaining. But some of the things have happened. As it says here, we were at 40%, close to 40% union members in the workforce of the U.S. In private sector. That's not including government sector, where there are still a number of unions. Postal workers are governed by a union. A lot of educators are governed by unions. But in the private sector, from 39% to just under 12% in 2010s. And when we think about examining the issue, have unions outlived their usefulness? Did they go from creating function to creating dysfunction? Or have the unions failed to adapt to the changing nature of our economy? And have they, in a certain sense, run into the same problem that Cesar Chavez ran into when he was trying to organize migrant workers, in that there's so much of our economy that's in the service sector, and trying to organize in the service sector is where you have a lot of immigrant workers that would be unwilling to participate in organizations like unions. There are labor unions. Those are organized workers who share either the same skill or the same employer. Membership in the labor unions, and there are federations of labor unions. But in the United States, membership in labor unions is declining, even as it tends to hold more steady, be a stronger presence in Europe. Some of the reasons that membership is declining: changes in industry, jobs which were dominated by unions have been outsourced, growth in part-time jobs, it's harder to organize part-time workers, protections, as I said, right-to-work laws inhibit collective bargaining power at times, globalization, which leads to outsourcing of work, which led to the exodus of manufacturing jobs from the U.S. to developing nations, employer offensives, employers, even sometimes illegal efforts to prevent union organizing, the union rigidity, unions' unwillingness to negotiate, and unwillingness to change with the times, and then of course bureaucratization. Unions became what's referred to as the institutional isomorphism. Organizations that face a similar set of environmental conditions inevitably come to resemble each other, and since unions underwent bureaucratization, there became key players in the unions who had all the power in the unions, and unions' adherence to rules led to the union rigidity. Unions are necessary, according to the Marxist or the functional and the functionalist perspective. So conflict and functionalism look at unions as a logical response to emergence of impersonal, large-scale, formal, and often alienating organizations. The workers need someone to represent them. In order for the workers to continue, both from a Marxist perspective and from a functionalist perspective, the workers need to have certain protections in place. If conditions become too hazardous for workers, nobody will fulfill those jobs, and those jobs, that particular function, will be denied to society. So unions, while they view the reasons for their existence differently, functionalists view unions more there just to protect the workers. Marxists view unions as a way of addressing inequality. But then neo-Marxist conflict theorists look at union leaders as shifting from representing the workers to becoming part of the elites in society. And many union employees wind up with what's, if you remember, role conflict. Their demands as a union representative, a negotiator, a diplomat, somebody who's going out to lunches and doing things like that, begin to create conflicts with their role as a representative of the workers. The U.S. union busting is illegal. However, employers do have legal ways that they can oppose unions. And they can actively point out how unions will harm all the workers. They are allowed to campaign against unions. That is unique in the U.S. So when we think about policy there, if we look at Europe, they're very different over there. Europe, employers are not really allowed to actively campaign against the formation of unions. Unions in the U.S. played a major role in elections in about the middle of the 20th century, but coming out of that, unions began losing power in the era of deregulation, and state and local governments facing significant budget deficits, which leads them to forcible negotiations with unions, where they have to enforce layoffs because they just don't have the money. In Europe, labor unions still tend to play a major role in political elections. In fact, in English government, the Labour Party is one of the major parties, and it represents the idea of labor and unions. Form and substance of unions varies from country to country. So we're not going to see the same thing in every single country. However, we will be able to see similarities in unions. Okay. That concludes our session for this week. Again, my name is Matthew Howell. I'm the full-time sociology instructor at the Valparaiso campus of Ivy Tech. My email address is mhowell1@ivytech.edu. That's mhowell1@ivytech.edu. If you have any questions about anything I've covered here, anything you need me to clear up, feel free to email me to ask. Thank you, and next week we will be covering Chapter 7. If I am remembering correctly, that will be crime and deviance. If not, I can't remember what